Editorial note: this podcast was completed the day before the news of the plane crash on August 23, 2023, that allegedly killed Wagner mercenary chief Yevgeny Prigozhin.
Welcome to the Epicenter podcast of the Weatherhead Center for International Affairs at Harvard University. I'm your host, Erin Goodman, Executive Director at the Weatherhead Center. We present today's episode in collaboration with the Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies and the Ukrainian Research Institute, both here at Harvard. Today we're going to explore the question of Russian resistance, or lack thereof, to the war in Ukraine. When the Wagner Group militia organization marched toward Moscow on June 24th, we briefly thought we were witnessing the unthinkable, a coup against Putin, or maybe even a civil war. The attempted mutiny against the Russian military may have failed, but it did raise important questions about the role of resistance to the Putin regime, and it exposed the downside of Russia's reliance on mercenaries to fight its war. In the aftermath of the Wagner episode, will Ukraine be able to exploit fissures in the Russian military for its counteroffensive? What forms could resistance take, and why isn't there more of it? We've invited 3 scholars to share their insights on these questions. Sasha Vogel is a postdoctoral researcher at the Authoritarian Politics Lab at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. She received her PhD from the University of Michigan in 2021 and was recently a Dorman Memorial Postdoctoral Fellow at the Weatherhead Center. Serhii Plokhy is a professor of history at Harvard and director of the Ukrainian Research Institute. He's the author of many books, including most recently The Frontline, Essays on Ukraine's Past and Present, as well as Atoms and Ashes, A Global History of Nuclear Disaster, and the Russo-Ukrainian War, The Return of History. Alexandra Vacru is the executive director of the Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies at Harvard. Her scholarly work addresses Russian and Eurasian policy issues, including the war in Ukraine. She also directs the Davis Center's Scholars Without Borders program that supports scholars from Ukraine, Russia, and Belarus. Let's start with whether or how this mutiny attempt changed the dynamics of the war. Serhii, let's start with you.
You just mentioned that we were looking at that with a shock and disbelief, and this is exactly the way how describes the emotions that I had at that time. But also I was, as a historian, thinking about historical parallels, and the closest to what I was watching were the Cossack revolts of the beginning of the 17th century. Of course, there are other parallels as well. But thinking about a more immediate context for that mutiny, for me, it's very clear that it's one of the outcomes of the Russian winter offensive of 2023 that went wrong, with Wagner Group really losing tens of thousands of people killed and even more of that wounded. And the attempts of the army to really integrate the Wagner Group into its ranks, that's what is the immediate context of that conflict, which to me suggested one thing, that things were not really going well for the Russian army on the front lines in Ukraine. And the second very important thing was that the mutiny made visible to all of us cracks within the edifice, not just of the Russian army, because up to 10 top Russian generals are under investigation today, but also cracks in the edifice of the Putin's regime in Russia, that till then everyone believed that was unshakable, that was there almost forever. And now the question that you hear most often is how long that regime would last, how serious was the blow, how weak is Putin as the result of this mutiny, and then apparent reluctance to punish the people whom he claimed to be traitors of Russia. So we are in many ways in a different world, at least when it comes to the sort of questions that we ask about this war, about the future of the Russian war effort and the future of the current Russian regime.
Alexandra, would you like to add anything?
Yes, I agree with Serhii in many ways. And I think that it's useful to separate the impact of the mutiny on the war, the way the war is being fought, and the way in which it might or might not have affected Putin's regime, which Serhii started to talk about. In terms of the direct impact on how the war is being fought, certainly the fact that Wagner is no longer going to be fighting as an independent mercenary group is going to be problematic for the Russian military. They were among the most effective fighters, and now they've pulled, it appears, completely out of the Ukrainian front, although there are rumors that they might be amassing in Belarus and planning something, either an attack from the north or possibly even on Poland as a distraction. So that will certainly come into the calculation of the actual military struggle on the ground. The second question, though, is whether there's an indirect impact on Putin's regime, or a direct impact on Putin's regime, which then indirectly affects the war. And as Serhii said, we were very surprised to see that there are some apparent fissures that could be exploited if they continue to fester. So one of the strongest examples of that, to my mind, is the fact that during the mutiny, which was a long weekend, or let's say a long day and a half, very few Russian elite figures came out in support of Putin. And one can only suspect that they were sitting back and waiting to see how things were going to shake out before taking sides. That suggests that even though everyone appears to be loyal to Putin in the elite, that behind the scenes, they might just be hedging their bets. And while they're not necessarily going to jump off the ship now, if there was an opportunity to have another leader that would be more effective, they might actually jump off very quickly. So that's something that we're watching. The second question is how it impacts civil-military relations. Right, before, the military was seen as more or less autonomous in fighting the war, as more or less depoliticized, but as crucial to Putin's myth about the regime and about the importance of a strong state. And we've seen a lot of glorification of World War II. And now, all of a sudden, because of Prigozhin's criticisms, there's the impression that perhaps the military isn't doing a great job on the ground, that perhaps they are part of political struggles or infighting around Putin, and also that Putin is no longer the strongman who's able to hold the regime together. So all of these tensions or pressures on what's happening in the Kremlin may have an effect on the war in the medium term.
So that gives us a sense of potential fissures within the regime and also some potential disassociation among elites. Now, if we could turn to the question of civilian resistance in Russia, what are people thinking on the ground? We've seen a near mutiny within the ranks of mercenaries, but does this reflect the thoughts and opinions of ordinary Russians? Sasha, you've already studied collective action in Russia for several years. What have you found since the war began, and what does resistance look like today?
So when the war began in Russia, Russian society at that time was already pretty poorly positioned to resist something like this, to try to organize a movement to impact what the regime wanted to do in terms of its foreign policy. The opposition leaders and organizations that could have organized, a national resistance movement had already been essentially hobbled by the government in some cases for several years. And also the regime works very hard to make sure that Russian society is depoliticized, so that people really aren't invested in what, or not really paying attention, let's say, to what the government is doing, not really interested in holding it to, represent their views. There's a strong tendency to just sort of let the people in charge, do what they were put there to do, and they can run the country, and sort of regular citizens don't need to worry about it. So still in the first few weeks after the invasion happened, we did see a number of anti-war protests around Russia, but these were sort of spontaneous or leaderless actions, although they were quite large in some of the major cities. However, after that, once the invasion started going rather badly, and it became apparent that they were not going to take Kiev in just a few days, the Duma started passing laws to restrict the sort of freedom of expression, restrict conversations about how the war was going. And that really rapidly escalated the consequences for expressing criticism of the war, even talking about the war, calling it a war in public.
Could you give some examples of these consequences?
Right. So two of the main two laws that have been used to suppress Russians' ability to discuss the war, and I guess in a negative way, but in some cases just purely to discuss it. They are the first is often referred to as the law on discrediting the military. So this makes it illegal to speak poorly of the military and its activities, and also includes groups like Wagner, actually. And the second is called the law on fakes, which prohibits the spread of the knowing spread of false information, of course, related to the war. So these are, very broadly written laws that have resulted in thousands of Russians being charged with violations, in some cases for things that one would not really think violate them. So recently somebody was fined for carrying a copy of War and Peace, a journalist. So it's common to violate these laws by referring to what's happening in Ukraine as a war, as opposed to as a special military operation. So a journalist was fined for using the word frontline when talking about the special military operation, because there are only front lines in wars, not special military operations. Someone was fined for saying publicly that he had a dream about Zelensky. It's very common for these violations to happen in the educational system. So teachers noticing that students have expressed something about the war and reporting them, or students noticing that teachers have said something about the war and reporting them. And of course, a lot of how these violations, let's say, are coming to the knowledge of the government is by Russians reporting on their friends, coworkers, neighbors, even their family members. There are tip lines that you can report these to, Telegram channels that you can send tips to. There are celebrities that have set up their own portals to receive tips of people who are discrediting the military or spreading fake news. And a very common way that happens is on social media. So posting something, liking a post, commenting on a post. These are all things that people have been prosecuted for. And the consequences for these, if you're charged as an administrative offense, like as your first time offense, it would be a fine. Since June, through the end of June this year, since the war started, Russians have paid 1.2 billion rubles, it's the equivalent of just over $14 million in fines for just discrediting the military. So this is a very common problem now. And yeah, that's like what I was going to say is so you have the fines, and then if you are prosecuted as a criminal offender under the criminal code for this, you can get, it's usually 5 to 7 years in prison. And that's if you've already had sort of your first offense and you're kind of a known offender, and that is less common. There have only been 90 cases since the war started through this year, but that's just an example of some of the repression that Russians are experiencing now.
Just to be clear, Russians do still have access to social media, correct?
I would say, generally speaking, Russians are a fairly tech-savvy population. So there are, of course, websites that are on the censors' blacklists. Recently, Meta, the company that owns Facebook and Instagram, was declared an extremist organization. So this gives it the same status basically as ISIS. However, with a VPN, you can easily navigate around those things. Channels like Telegram, this is the most popular Russian social media site, are completely available to them to use. And I also want to point out that when you install a VPN to access Instagram, you also have access to the entire world's internet, right? It's not just Instagram or Facebook that you've gained access to. You've gained access to all of the Western press coverage about the war, all of the Ukrainian content about the war. So it's not as if Russians are sort of operating in this completely strangled media environment just because they don't have a free media in their country. They do have the ability to gain information. Information is circulated comparatively freely on Telegram. So they do have access to it. It seems to be more that there is not an interest in consuming or thinking critically about that information.
Can I ask Sasha a follow-up question? What are the polls of Russian citizens worth? Like, can we get any reliable information from polling data?
Can we ever? I mean, that's a really common question with polling all the time, right? You know, how accurate are they? Of course, in authoritarian states like in Russia, we have always had these questions about, you know, how accurate is it really? Can we really say that Putin has an 80% approval rating? That seems impossible. All of the studies that we've done on that before the war suggest that Putin's approval rating is only usually inflated by about 5 to 10%. So it's still very high. There has not been a lot of fluctuation in his approval rating since the war has started, and it remains quite high. I looked at some data that is from a weekly poll that's done online of a smaller sample. So it's not you know, as reliable as what like a formal polling organization would do, but that puts his approval rating at around 75%. There's absolutely more incentive for Russians to lie or ignore polling groups when they try to ask them if they support Putin or they support the war. But the numbers are really quite high. They've always been high. So I think it wouldn't be appropriate to, you know, look at those polls and say like, oh, well, you know, they just can't really express themselves. Like a good portion of those people are genuinely expressing themselves. So yes, we have to be skeptical of them, but they also do provide a data point that we can look at sort of in line with other information that we're able to collect.
Is it fair to say that the new laws have had their intended effect of dampening dissent? So what are you seeing today in Russia?
Since spring 2022, we've seen very little organized protest, street protest in resistance and opposition to the war. Instead, what we see are more individualized actions, things like graffiti or hanging a banner or standing on a street corner with a blank piece of paper. And these people do take a lot of risk to engage in those actions. They do face legal consequences for doing that. However, these are symbolic acts that really allow those people to express their opinions. They are not the foundation of you know, a large-scale movement, a political movement that could affect the course of the war. And I think it's also important to remember that those actions are being undertaken by a minority of the population. So I think a lot of people in the West, we look at what's happening in Russia and we want to assume that Russians are sort of democratic citizens who are just forced to repress what they truly think because they're afraid of the government. And if they just didn't have these restrictions, they would stand up against the war. That's really not in line with what we see from opinion polling data, from, you know, field work that people do, interviews they have with Russians. It seems that the majority of Russians are really largely apathetic or passively supportive when it comes to the war. So they're willing to go along with it now that it's happening. Maybe they wouldn't have chosen this path, but they've accepted it now that it's the course that the country is on. And then a good portion of them are actively supportive of it. And even when we see actions that look like they're opposition to us, people leaving the country, protests against the partial mobilization that happened in the fall where they forced men into military service, these are often actually grievances about how the war is affecting Russians, not about how the war is affecting Ukrainians. So they're not like principled moral opposition to the war. They're protests about how Russians are being affected by the war, which is, those are two distinct things.
So this gives us a good sense of the media coverage in Russia and the general opinion of people on the ground. I'm curious about in Ukraine. Alexandra, you were there recently. How would you describe the morale of Ukrainians at this point in the war? And Serhii, feel free to also jump in as well.
It was quite remarkable to spend a little bit of time in Ukraine about a month ago in July. You know, there's a feeling of solidarity and unity that you don't have in a country that has no reason to think that there's a common purpose. I found it quite striking, you know, compared to the United States, where we talk sometimes about being in a crisis of democracy and that our government is at risk or our way of life is at risk. And you realize how little power that has in the United States when you go to Ukraine and you realize that people believe that victory is possible, but it requires that everybody do their part. And the sense of purpose that I have never experienced before. And even though people are conscious that it's dangerous, there's a lot of people walking around in military fatigues everywhere, there's security, you still get a sense that people know why they're fighting and they know that it's important. And at the moment, at least, that feeling seems very, very strong.
Serhii, would you agree with that? And also, would you say that the media portrayal in the Ukraine is in line with other Western media coverage?
Well, I'm going to be in Ukraine later in the month. What I see in the media, what I see on the Facebook, Twitter, certainly confirms what Alexandra just said. There is this level of unity and level of confidence in the ultimate victory that is truly surprising. That was there even at the most difficult moments in the war, 1-2 weeks after the all-out invasion by Russia. In March of 2022, still 70%, more than 70% of people polled in Ukraine believed in victory. And there is, as far as I understand, of course, growing fatigue, but somehow this fatigue doesn't affect the determination of Ukrainians to fight back. And there is also discussion going on about what victory would mean for Ukraine, and quite often it is defined in terms of the territory, in terms of the borders, either the borders of 2022 or the borders of 2014, 1991. But overall, there is growing thinking about the victory as about the end of the war, after which Russia would not be able actually to continue expansion in the near future. So they think also quite practical in terms of their neighborhood with Russia. And as long as Russia continues to be authoritarian, as long as Russia continues to be aggressive, as long as Russia has the ability, the resources to fight the war, Ukrainians certainly will not be safe, and whatever would be called victory probably would not be accepted by people at large. And what we associate Ukraine with mostly here in the West is really remarkable performance by the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. And what sometimes is lost, that Volodymyr Zelensky is there to represent his people, to represent Ukraine. That what we hear from Zelensky, it's very much echoes or maybe amplifies what Ukrainians on the street think and how they feel.
As we know, Ukrainians have also suffered profound losses, major destruction. Millions have chosen to leave. Curious about how the demographics have changed and what impact this has on Ukraine's ability to defend itself or to rebuild in the future. Alexandra or Serhii, could you comment on the immediate and longer term future for the country as the demographics shift?
Serhii, you start.
Sure. We talk, and for very good reason, about this war as the largest military conflict in Europe since World War II. And I start thinking about it more and more as the largest military conflict in the world after the Second World War, in terms of the industrial warfare, in terms of the armies involved, in terms of the technologies that are on the battlefield. But this is also the largest conflict in Europe and one of the largest in the world when it comes to the suffering, when it comes to the number of refugees. The estimates are that today up to 6 million people left Ukraine and are outside of the country. It's also a very particular type of the immigration. Men stay, and it's almost exclusively women, children, and elderly who are in the neighboring countries of Central or East Central Europe. The Ukrainian refugees were really welcomed by the neighboring states. That raised a lot of questions about treatment of other waves of refugees, in particular from Middle East in Europe. But it was also the not only reception was different, but also the attitudes of the refugees themselves were different for a long period of time. Very few of them actually were thinking about immigrating. Very few of them were thinking about staying in those countries permanently. Part of that reason was that the family were divided. The man stayed in Ukraine. But the recent poll and the recent data shows that approximately half of those who stayed outside of Ukraine, they're thinking about immigrating, about staying there permanently. So the longer the war goes, the higher the chances are that Ukraine can lose part of its population. So that's a big issue that was not there 1 year ago, but is here today, and probably will become even more an issue if the war continues to go. Another big issue is, of course, not just the number of people killed, and we don't know about that. There are estimates regarding the Russian army. The losses on the Ukrainian side are probably equally high, maybe a little bit less, as Ukrainians were on the defensive. But now that Ukraine tries to execute a major counteroffensive in the area, what we read is that for the first time, number of people who were injured by mines, and that also means the number of amputees, is higher than the number of people who are injured by the artillery fire, which was the part of the story that characterized the earlier stages of the war. So it's enormous impact of the war on Ukrainian economy, Ukrainian infrastructure, on Ukrainian population, on numbers, on demography. It's almost difficult to believe that against all that background, there is relatively little change to the Ukrainian morale. And people want to talk about the future of Ukraine after the war. So that's what maybe psychologically helps them to go through. So it is still an attitude overall. The public attitude tries to be positive despite all these losses, and it's not just the numbers. It's daily alerts, it's the daily attacks, it's the nights that people can't sleep in their own beds. So the situation in Ukraine is on all these levels is of course very difficult, and the morale of the people is really amazing. Ukraine fights this fight not just for Ukraine itself. And to end the war sooner, we have to help as much as we can, and not play games with these weapons are allowed and those weapons are not allowed for no obvious reason at all. Not to raise eyebrows about how come that Ukrainians are not effective in their current counteroffensive, when neither United States nor any other country fought any war since 1945, at least, where there was no superiority in the air and Ukrainians denied airplanes, and then the questions are asked, what is going wrong with the Ukrainian counteroffensive? So it's time to get really serious about helping Ukraine to end this war.
Alexandra?
If I could go back to the question of demographics just for a moment, Serhii alludes to the problems that Ukraine will face in reconstruction and in recovering from the war afterwards. And one of the things that people are most concerned about is that there are some of these demographic trends which potentially have very long tails or very lasting impacts. So there's not only the fact that women and children have left, And the longer they stay abroad and get used to schools and learn languages, the more difficult it is for them to return. But there's also the fact that the birth rate has dropped. So before the war, Ukraine was having about 23,000 babies a month. Now it's down to 16,000 babies. And maybe some of those are being born abroad, but that's still a dramatic plunge in the birth rate. And also there's a very real fear of brain drain, of people deciding that it's going to be too difficult to pursue their professions or their careers in Ukraine, even after the war is over, and they'll try and find jobs abroad. And all of those factors are going to make it really important for Ukraine to have a plan for reconstruction and renewing itself when the war is over. Of course, as the longer the war lasts, the more difficult that's going to be.
So even before these demographic shifts, Russia is still 3 times larger than Ukraine. So thinking towards the end of a war, it seems that resistance within Russia is a key factor. Do any of you see where might resistance emerge within Russia? Is it in the elites or the oligarchs? Is it possible, or is it again in a paramilitary organization such as the Wagner group? Or is it overly optimistic to think that there will be enough resistance to make a change? Sasha, do you want to weigh in on that question?
Well, it would be, I think, a speedier end to the conflict. So it's a slightly optimistic view if there was opposition emerging from within Russia, whether it's from the elite or from the general population or even from the military, that could some way hasten the end of this. Realistically speaking, we have no reason to believe that that is on the horizon. As I already discussed, it does not appear at this time that the general public is going to actively begin to resist the war. And even when that does occur, it takes quite a long time for an popular anti-war movement to have the effect of ending a war. And oftentimes it simply does not effectively end the war. When you look at the Russian elites, which we've already talked about, the elites are all very invested in the continuation of the Putin regime. They also all basically derive their power and privilege and, their positions from their proximity to Putin. This makes it very difficult for anyone to have an incentive to act against him. But also it makes it very difficult for the elites to collaborate with each other, which you need to let's say, peaceably remove him from power. It's hard to imagine the elites in Russia right now agreeing on who might replace Putin, because there would dramatically change sort of who's a winner and who's a loser among these very powerful people. It's hard to even imagine the elites agreeing to support the military in a coup, as we saw recently with the Prigozhin incident. It's not as if the elites were rushing to support the Russian military or Prigozhin. They were sort of hedging their bets, as Alexandra pointed out. And that's partially because loyalty in Russia is essentially transactional. These elites are not supporting Putin because they love him personally, although, some of them are his close friends. They're supporting him, they're loyal to him because it keeps them in power. It keeps them, extracting money from Russia, extracting money from the war. It keeps them where they want to be. So I think it's very unlikely that at this time they're going to act against Putin. It is quite a serious problem when we look at, how long this war might last and how it will continue to affect Ukraine, as we've just been discussing, because Putin also really has no incentive to end this war right now. That could change, but over the last year and a half, the war effort has become an increasingly core part of the sort of sense of ideology that the Putin regime has always lacked or never really fully established. We've seen quite extensive changes to state-society relations in Russia, trying to convince people to serve in the military, to participate in this sort of fortress Russia propaganda, to passively support the war, by which I mean publicly going along with supporting the war, even if they privately don't. We've seen a slew of legal changes to ensure these things are happening, the transformation of the Russian economy, the transformation of its role in the world. These things are hard to reverse, and Putin, I think, will continue to prosecute this war until he dies, honestly. He can't accept defeat here. He is not going to accept sort of like a dismantling or a weakening of Russia, and he has extensive resources that he can continue to throw at this and extend it as long as he sees fit to pursue his goal of destroying Ukraine.
I may jump in. I certainly agree with Sasha that Putin will continue the war as long as he is in power. So Putin is war is Putin in this context. I also have difficulty imagining anyone replacing him, continuing with the war. First of all, because it is so damaging for Russia, for Russian economy, standing in the world. And speaking historically about the stability of the regime that Prigozhin's mutiny showed is not as stable as we imagined before, I can say that the war that go wrong produce regime change in Russia and produce revolutions. Now, this is the case of the revolution of 1905 that was triggered by the defeat in the Far East in the war between Russia and Japan. This is the story of the revolution of 1917 that starts with the refusal of the troops to go to the front lines from Petrograd at that time, the capital of the country. And Afghan war that didn't go well was a contributing factor also to Gorbachev's reforms and the fall of the Soviet Union. In my reading, Prigozhin would not be there without the winter offensive this year for Russia not going wrong. So I very much link the future of regime in Russia to the successes on the front or failures on the front line in Ukraine. If the current counteroffensive or any future counteroffensive succeeds, I certainly am prepared to be less surprised than I was in June of this year about another mutiny. What Prigozhin's mutiny exposed were cracks within the military itself, not just among the mercenaries, and ability of the regime to defend itself, we now know is quite weak. When Prigozhin was moving to Moscow, there were no really armed units from the army, from the front lines, including the Putin's National Guard, eager to rush and save regime and save Putin. And as Alexander Vogel mentioned, people were sitting on the fence, watching where it would go. So I am prepared to see change in Moscow in a relatively near future. But for that change to occur, there has to be a major defeat in Ukraine, on the front lines in Ukraine. If that defeat doesn't happen, if the stalemate continues, my bet is, as Sasha was saying, on the continuation of the regime for all the reasons that she described.
I just want to add that one of the things that I think was particularly shocking about how the Prigozhin mutiny was handled was that was not that it showed sort of these weaknesses within the various parts of the armed forces, the military, the private military groups. It was that Putin allowed this conflict to become so public and then handled it in a frankly incompetent way. Part of Putin's job, his what many people see to be really one of his key roles, is that he's an arbiter of conflicts. He resolves conflicts before they become known to the public behind the scenes. He sort of balances all of these competing elite interests. He is sort of the center of that wheel. And what we saw happening between Wagner and the military playing out over the course of months. It was not an urgent sort of, it wasn't just that weekend, it was the course of months trying to resolve the situation between them, was Putin's failure to address that issue before something like this happened. I think that was very shocking that he has never let really, I mean, sometimes you see sort of skirmishes between, I mean, Prigozhin and the governor of St. Petersburg had sort of a longstanding public dispute that also was quite shocking, like surprising to people that Putin would allow that to play out in public. This situation was on a whole nother level that really sort of causes you to doubt Putin's ability to play the same role in the regime that he has in the past. And then likewise, his reaction to the invasion, or sorry, excuse me, his reaction to the mutiny while it was happening was, as I said, sort of strikingly incompetent, that there was no effort to stop this convoy moving towards Moscow. You had governors sort of deciding to tear up the highway en route to Moscow to try to stop them because there was no military assistance coming. The sort of long span of silence from the Kremlin. Of course, Medvedev and Putin and sort of some of the top officials immediately hopped in their planes and got out of town and towards safety. But this is really not what you expect from someone who is serving in that role. Even Prigozhin himself, I think, was quite shocked by how close he got to Moscow. It didn't appear that he was actually prepared to march on Moscow itself. He was more trying to draw attention to this issue and expected to be stopped far sooner than he was.
Let's talk about other ways the war could shift or resolve, barring a widespread resistance or another mutiny. Alexandra?
So I just wanted to come at this question of how the war might end from a different angle, which is the war termination literature. Professor Timothy Colton and Sam Cherub have an interesting piece on the different ways in which wars end. And generally, there are three categories. Right? One is totally victory by one of the sides. One is a negotiated settlement, and the third is protracted conflict. And if you look at what total victory would mean here, for Ukraine, it would mean expelling Russia from all of its territory, including Crimea and the Donbass. For Russia, it means total control of the government of Kiev, probably through a puppet. Neither of those outcomes seems particularly likely at this point. And remember that people don't change their goals in the war. Usually the sides don't decide that actually they don't want to control Ukraine, or actually they don't want to keep their territory. What happens is that they get new information, usually on the battlefield, that they don't have the capability to achieve their goals. And then they're willing to consider that maybe their goal is out of reach, so they need to reach a negotiated settlement. And that's when you would have sides that come to the table. The problem is that if neither side believes that it's going to lose, and Ukraine believes that it will continue to have enough Western support to fight with Russia. Russia believes that the West is fickle and therefore will eventually give up on Ukraine, and it's just a waiting game. If both sides believe that time is on their side, no one has an incentive to come to the table and negotiate. And unfortunately, what we find is that a quarter of wars end in about a week. Another quarter end within a year, and the ones that don't end within a year can go on for a very long time. And that's the third scenario of protracted conflict, which unfortunately, we're already in this war over a year.
So far, I haven't heard anyone mention the prospect of escalation, whether that means other countries get involved in the war, or if Russia were to act on its threats to use tactical nuclear weapons. The rhetoric seems to have quieted lately, and I'm wondering what this means.
Well, the escalation is something that's very much on the mind, certainly, of governments in the world, including the US government. The fear of escalation and imagining the red lines that exist or don't exist in Putin's mind. This is, it seems to me, the daily exercise in the White House. That's also the reason, in my at least understanding, of why certain types of weapons are supplied and others are not supplied. So there is a concern about that. On the Russian side, there is a blackmail game about escalation, in which Putin participates himself, making all sorts of hints about strategic forces and nuclear arms. And the former Russian president, Dmitry Medvedev, of course, made a career out of going out there publicly and threatening Armageddon, and doing that again and again. The Wagner group, the moment it moved to Belarus, things that we hear is about them recruiting people allegedly to go to Warsaw, which is a NATO country. And recently, apparently, 2 Belarusian helicopters crossed the Polish border, and Poles are bringing in troops to the Belarus and Belarusian border. The idea of Russia or Belarus going to war with NATO is, of course, quite ridiculous. So it's an example of blackmail. The use of the nuclear weapons, including tactical ones, also those threats don't look credible at this moment, given the position of publicly expressed position of China. So the easiest, the simplest, and the safest way to end the war is to allow Ukrainians actually to win on the battlefield. The option of some sort of negotiated settlement is being discussed and is being discussed as reasonable. It is a very highly unreasonable proposition when you look at that from the perspective of Ukraine, the country where the war started back in 2014 and where a settlement was reached, two Minsk agreements, back in 2014 and 2015, which gave Putin more time actually to get back to build stronger army and then get back to the business of taking Kyiv under control. So for Ukrainians, it's highly unreasonable to imagine that the new settlement would actually produce a different result, so somehow will make Putin to reconsider his ultimate goal. Escalation, whether it's possible, everything is possible. Whether it's likely at this point, I don't think so. Escalation meaning the war going beyond the borders of Ukraine.
Alexandra, what do you think?
Now, I'd like to jump in and just say that I agree with Serhii that at the moment, escalation, both in terms of spreading beyond the territory of Ukraine and in terms of ratcheting up the kinds of weaponry that's being used, meaning the use of more chemical weapons or tactical nuclear weapons, seems unlikely. And that's because both NATO and the US and Russia are treating this as a limited conflict. Right? So the United States has told Ukraine that it cannot use the weapons that it's receiving to strike targets in Russia. Russia is not striking the supply lines that bring NATO weapons to Ukraine across the country, although they could. And so there's an attempt on both sides to keep things confined to Ukraine, which of course is terrible for Ukraine itself, which, as Serhii points out, has not been given enough weaponry to actually win the war, just to ensure a kind of stalemate or possibly, ultimately a counteroffensive. So that brings up a fundamental tension, which is that nobody, apart from Ukraine, has a clear idea of what it means to win this war. And if we believe that winning the war means that Ukraine has to be able to keep Russia from controlling part of its territory, then what we should do should be clear, right? We should be giving Ukraine what it needs to win. If we continue doing what we're doing and we prolong what we're doing until the next presidential election, for example, or until the Russians are able to remobilize more people, we just prolong the conflict to the expense, the horror of what's going on the ground. So one of the issues that I think is only becoming more clear is that the United States has avoided clearly articulating what it wants from this conflict. If it believes that Russia must be stopped, then Russia must be stopped now. If it believes that this kind of stalemate can go on for a long time, as long as it's contained in Ukraine, then we can continue what we're doing. But that's not what the Biden administration has been saying. Additional clarity about the goals and what we're willing to do to achieve them is absolutely essential at this point.
Sasha, your thoughts on this?
I think that for the US to articulate what those goals are and properly communicate them to the American public would also be very important. As you might have surmised from several of my comments here, oftentimes, especially Americans, look at Russia, including people who work in government and make some of these decisions, with this sort of naive optimism that somehow things are not the way they appear to be. And this is partially because, yes, Putin does lie all the time about, do they want to use nuclear weapons and things like that. But it's not as if he's going to suddenly change his mind. It's not as if he's going to suddenly, withdraw from Crimea just because he wants to. It's not as if he's going to suddenly start caring about the value of human life. We know this. Everything that we have seen him do over the last several years and indeed over the course of his time in office we understand what he wants and how he acts. We understand how Russians are going to respond to it. I feel like a lot of the sort of reluctance to kind of for the US to really fully support Ukraine and for the general public to really like grasp how serious this conflict is arises from this sort of willful like delusion almost that somehow it's just not as bad as it really seems, but it is that bad. You know, if we don't do something to help this conflict end, it could go on for an extremely long time at extraordinary cost to Ukrainians who are already giving everything to stop it just because we think that maybe it's Putin might one day accept a compromise. He won't, and we don't need to compromise with him. There are other ways to end this.
I think there is something, you know, and it kind of ties into what Sasha said, is that like the US has not been clear, and I understand why, but it hasn't been clear, like, what does it want to get from Russia here? Does it want Russia to lose? Does it want Russia not to be able to invade its neighbors? Does it want Russia to understand that if it takes foreign territory, that it's going to pay a price? If that's the message that we're trying to convey, then there are things you need to do to support Ukraine in its fight to make sure that doesn't happen. And I think that is actually the American objective, but we don't want to say it out loud because then Russia might, you know, get upset or escalate, even though I think what we've seen so far is that all of these alleged threats to escalate are basically bluff, right? There's nothing that's going to happen that's kind of inconsistent with what's already happening on the battlefield. And the more Putin threatens to escalate and doesn't, the weaker the threats become. You know, there's a way in which people say, oh, Putin, you know, he's unhinged, he's crazy, he's sick, he's dying. And all of that actually serves the Russians, because then, you know, if Putin is unhinged, we better be very careful because we have no idea what's going to set him off. Like maybe we send this weapon system and that's what he decides is an existential threat to Russia. So we have to be very careful because he's that cornered rat. And he could strike out at everybody. And in fact, he's not unhinged, right? He's rational. He's making calculations and assumptions based on what he believes, which I agree with Sasha is not what we believe. And to just dismiss him as a madman makes it seem as if we have to be extra careful, right? It kind of puts the brakes on what we would do if we weren't worried that he was crazy.
I think that whoever advised President Biden and put those words in his mouth was correct. And the words were that he is rational, but he miscalculated.
Exactly. Yeah, I agree with that.
I certainly agree with that. Yeah.
Let's end on the concept of a rational dictator who has gravely miscalculated. Whether it's a war of attrition or a war of exhaustion, the devastating cost of this so-called miscalculation is unconscionable to many. I'd like to thank all three of our guests today for this sobering inside view on resistance, determination, and the potential longevity of this very destructive war. This is Erin Goodman signing off from the Weatherhead Center for International Affairs at Harvard University. To hear more meaningful conversations like this one, please follow Epicenter on your favorite listening platform.